She stood there, her face swollen from trying to hold back the tears. What nobody knew was that she was the owner of the store, and her skin was what was separating her from her dignity. When her millionaire father caught her being humiliated, he didn't know what to do. What would you do if you saw your daughter being treated as no one deserves? And most importantly, how did he react when he found out that her pain wasn't just because she was his daughter, but because she was who she was? Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever been ignored or despised because of something you couldn't control? Yes, many people live like this every day. And it's not just a question of being less fortunate than others. In a world where skin color, social class, and origin determine so much, this story of a daughter being humiliated in her own store will make you think deeply about the true nature of people. This isn't just a story about a millionaire father and his daughter. It's a story about prejudice, overcoming, and the impact our actions have on others. Get ready for a real roller coaster of emotions. Maria always knew that the world wouldn't be easy for her. She grew up in a simple neighborhood where most people struggled with the same difficulties: low-paid jobs, few resources, and a constant feeling that, no matter how hard she worked, there would always be an invisible barrier preventing her from achieving what she deserved. Her parents, especially her mother, always encouraged her to dream big. You are not limited by your past, child, and the color of your skin is not a sentence. What defines you is what you do with what you have, her mother would say with a smile full of hope, even when the difficulties seemed insurmountable. Her father, on the other hand, was always very business-minded. He built up a considerable fortune over the course of his life. From a young age, he was known for his bold vision and his ability to make good investments. When he became successful, his name became respected in business and political circles. However, this success also brought him an emotional burden. He knew what he had faced throughout his life, but he felt powerless in the face of his daughter's daily struggle. He wanted to protect Maria from everything he had experienced, from all the difficulties, but she was determined to forge her own path. Maria's store was his greatest achievement so far. In her heart, she knew that opening it was more than just a step into the world of business. It was proof to herself that she wouldn't be dependent on anyone. She didn't want to be seen as the millionaire's daughter. She wanted to be seen as a strong, capable woman with a bright future ahead of her. But reality began to show itself differently. Every customer who entered the store seemed to make a point of ignoring her, of treating her with disdain, as if the fact that she was the store owner was something impossible to believe. For months, Maria tried to smile and move on. She tried with all her might to make the customers see her as a professional and not as someone who was there for a favor. But with each new day, she felt more and more invisible. She had never really known what it was like to be judged by the color of her skin. Of course, she had heard the stories of her mother, who faced prejudice in her youth. But she always thought that, in the modern world, things would be different. After all, her father had come so far, and he always said that the people who really made a difference were those who dedicated themselves, not those who cried about their disadvantages. But the reality was different. When Maria looked at the customers passing by the store, she saw uncomfortable looks on their faces. Some didn't disguise their discomfort, looking at her with an almost palpable strangeness. Others, more subtle, simply paid no attention, preferring to talk to the white employee next to them, even when it was she who had the answers to their questions. And that was just the beginning. At times, Maria found herself questioning herself. Was she exaggerating? Were things really as she thought, or was she seeing prejudice where it didn't exist? But then came the days when customers made a point of treating her indifferently, in an understated way. It was as if she were a shadow in the store itself. The feeling of being invisible began to suffocate her. When a customer entered, she already knew that her position was that of an observer, of someone who had no importance in the buying process. But what hurt most was not the explicit contempt. What hurt most was the silence, the simple fact that people didn't notice her, didn't see her as someone capable. Maria tried everything. She changed her posture, started dressing more formally, improved her negotiation skills, and became more present in every interaction. But nothing seemed to work. When people addressed her, they quickly looked away, as if she were a mistake, as if she had no right to be there. The feeling of not belonging, of always being on the sidelines, began to take over her mind. Maria began to wonder if she was really on the right track. She was no longer fighting against the difficulties of a business. She was fighting against expectations, against the limitations that people placed on her because of who she was. The color of her skin was directly interfering with her ability to be seen, respected, and valued. And then there was that day. She was behind the counter, as usual, when a customer came in. He seemed to be just looking around, but when he passed by Maria, he completely ignored her. He didn't ask her a single question. Maria, as usual, didn't want to force the situation. He was there to buy, and she didn't want to be intrusive. But when he approached the service area, he asked for information directly from the white employee standing next to Maria. She noticed the difference. The customer looked at the employee, asked a question, smiled at her. At that moment, Maria knew that this was not normal. What made her feel even more powerless was the look on the employee's face. With a friendly smile, she gave her answer, but the look of pity was clear. Maria tried to disguise her pain, but it was as if her soul had been ripped out at that moment. She knew that prejudice still existed, but she hadn't imagined that it would be so palpable, so real, in a business that she herself had built. It wasn't just contempt or indifference. It was a silent humiliation, a way of telling her, without words, that she wasn't worthy, that her success was an accident, an exception to the rule. And what hurt the most was that she didn't know what to do with it. She felt paralyzed. Every time a client turned to her with a cold stare, she felt as if she was being taken to a place of no return. A sense of failure and powerlessness began to overwhelm her. How could she keep fighting when she herself was being destroyed by something she had no control over? It was at that very moment, when she felt that the pain of being invisible was becoming unbearable, that her father entered the store. He who had always been in control of his life, who had gone through countless difficulties and achieved so much, saw his daughter crumble before his eyes. He felt the weight of everything she was facing, the weight of the silent humiliation that was killing her inside. And for the first time, he realized that, as much as he had tried to protect her, he couldn't save her from something as deep, something as cruel as prejudice. What happened to Maria that day was a watershed. For the first time in her adult life, she felt completely powerless. Before, she had always believed that difficulties could be overcome with hard work and dedication. That had always been her family's mantra. When you work hard, results come. This was the fundamental belief that had underpinned her worldview until then. But that day, she saw that hard work isn't always enough. Sometimes there are bigger forces at play, invisible forces that shape people's destiny in ways that cannot be easily controlled. Prejudice was not something she could simply ignore or overcome with more effort. It was an invisible but implacable barrier. The shock of this realization hit her deeply. Maria began to realize more than ever that there was a chasm between her and others. It was a chasm she didn't know how to cross. She had always known that the world would be harder for her, but she had never imagined that the line between success and failure could be so thin, so sensitive to other people's gaze. She wasn't just dealing with other people's lack of confidence. It wasn't simply a question of being a novice entrepreneur trying to make a name for herself in the market. No, the problem was something much deeper. Something that seemed ingrained in the fabric of society. Something that said, in a cruel whisper, that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong there. However, the pain of humiliation wasn't the worst of it. The worst thing was that, in many moments, she began to doubt herself. Doubt slowly crept into her mind, a subtle idea that infiltrated her thoughts and never left. Did she really deserve to be there? Was she just living out a fantasy that society had created for her, just because she was the daughter of the right man, because she was lucky enough to be born into an environment that gave her an advantage? Or had she actually earned her position on her own merits? In every corner of the store, Maria felt people's eyes on her, their judgments and unspoken criticisms. But it was in the loneliest moments, when she was left alone after the store had closed, that the pain became unbearable. The silence inside her own mind consumed her. She no longer knew what to think, what to do, or how to move on. The feeling of being watched constantly became oppressive. Even though her father offered emotional support, Maria knew that he didn't understand the weight of what she was going through. He came from a different generation, one that struggled against visible, tangible obstacles. For him, the solution was always to face the problem head-on, to fight with all his might. For Maria, however, the problem was something she couldn't touch. There was no fighting it. There was no way to argue or debate with people who saw her as a mere shadow. She felt like she was in a constant battle, but a battle she couldn't win because the enemy was invisible and disguised as normality. What devastated her even more was the fact that she often saw the people around her being treated differently. The white employee, who always seemed to receive more respect and attention, even when she made mistakes, became a cruel reflection of the distance between the two. When Maria spoke to a customer, he would quickly look away and seek out the employee next to him. When she explained the products, the customers looked at her, but the feeling was that they weren't really listening. But when she spoke, people immediately turned to her with a smile on their faces, paying attention to every word. It was as if Maria was invisible, a mere extra in her own store. Sometimes the pain of being ignored was so great that she felt like she was sinking. The feeling of being a ghost in her own space was a psychological torture that she didn't know how to bear. This emotional anguish was eating away at Maria from the inside out. But at the same time, she began to realize something that had previously gone unnoticed. There was something inside her that didn't want to give in. A voice inside her mind whispered, "You can't let this destroy you." This thought came up in the most unusual situations, such as when she was alone in the store, tidying up the shelves, or when she was making calculations and planning the next sales strategy. It was a force, perhaps the only thing she could still control, that said, "Get up, don't give up." But the doubt was greater. What would happen if she kept trying? What would happen if she fell even deeper into the emotional trap that seemed to have been set around her? And it was during one of these deep reflections, one evening after another day of frustration and pain, that Maria received a phone call from one of her father's investors. He wanted her to go to an important meeting the next day. Maria hesitated. She knew that this could be a golden opportunity for the future of the store, but she also knew that if she went there, she would have to expose herself once again to those judgmental stares. She was afraid of being ignored again, of being treated as someone who had no value. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to stand still. The store needed to grow. She needed to grow. She needed to prove to herself that she wasn't just the millionaire's daughter. She needed to prove that, despite everything that was happening around her, she was worthy of being there, that she was capable of carving out her own space in the world. What she didn't know was that that phone call would be the start of an even bigger change, something she never imagined would happen. Something that would force her to face her deepest fears, her own insecurities, and the prejudice that surrounded her in a way she could never have predicted. That meeting would be the turning point. And at that moment, Maria didn't know if she was about to take the biggest step of her life or the biggest mistake of her career. The day of the meeting arrived, and Maria felt an overwhelming tension. What was supposed to be an event of great importance for the future of the store had turned into an emotional battleground. She looked in the mirror before leaving the house and saw herself reflected there, with a mixture of insecurity and determination in her eyes. The carefully simple black dress she had chosen was designed to convey professionalism. However, when she looked at herself, she felt small, as if the whole world was watching, waiting for her to fail. The investor's words echoed in her mind. "This is your chance to show that you have what it takes to run the store. Don't let your father down." But the weight of prejudice and doubt she carried seemed unbearable, and the idea of failing wasn't just linked to not being able to close the deal, but to the feeling of not being good enough. What would happen if she failed? What would happen if they saw her only as the millionaire's daughter, worthless in her own right? On the way to the meeting, Maria was overwhelmed by a sense of derealization, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. With every corner she passed, the fear intensified. When she finally reached the building where the meeting was to take place, she stopped at the entrance, looking at the glass door in front of her. There was the turning point. Her life could change in seconds. She could go forward and show her strength, or retreat and remain the shadow of someone she never wanted to be. The feeling of being paralyzed took hold of her. But when she touched the door handle, something inside her broke. She didn't know where this force came from, but the decision was made. No matter what happened, she would no longer be ignored. Maria walked into the meeting room with her head held high, trying to shake off the feeling of helplessness that accompanied her. The investor and other members of the team were sitting around the table, all looking so self-assured, so imposing. She sat down in front of them, not knowing exactly what to expect. It was as if she was about to be tested in an exam where the criteria were unclear. The first words out of her mouth were hesitant, but she stuck to them. She talked about the store's growth targets, about the changes she would like to implement, trying to hide the internal struggle that was still going on inside her. The investor seemed impassive, listening intently, but his eyes, however disguised, never failed to probe every detail of her posture, her behavior. She felt it. She felt that he was evaluating her not only for her ability, but also for her appearance, for the simple fact that she was who she was. The silence in the room seemed heavy. The tension grew by the second. But then something happened. During one of the explanations, Maria paused strategically, trying to organize her thoughts. It was at that moment that she noticed the gaze of the white employee, who was present at the meeting as an assistant, turned towards her. It wasn't a look of respect or admiration. It was a look disguised as judgment. And it was at that moment that Maria felt the impact of everything she had experienced up to that point. Something broke inside her. She couldn't let it go any longer. She could no longer let people continue to ignore her, to see her as a shadow. She felt a force emerge, something primal and visceral. A wave of emotion that was no longer about being the millionaire's daughter or what the investor thought of her, but about her truth. The truth she had been hiding from herself for so long. She looked directly at the investor and, for the first time, spoke with a tone of authority she didn't know she possessed. This store doesn't need my family to survive. It needs a leader who understands the market, who understands the customers, and who is able to innovate. I'm not just my father's daughter. I am an entrepreneur, and my value is not determined by my surname, but by my ability to generate results. The words came out like a silent cry of liberation. Maria knew she had crossed a line. She knew that this moment would be remembered forever, as the day she finally gave herself over to the truth she had been hiding from everyone, including herself. The investor looked at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. She could see in his gaze that he was assessing the situation differently now. It was no longer about appearances or what he thought she should be. It was about what she was demonstrating at that moment. The meeting took its course, but something had changed. Maria felt that she was finally being seen for who she really was. Not a shadow, not someone's daughter, but a woman of her own worth. When the meeting was over and everyone got up to say goodbye, the investor approached her. "You have much more potential than I imagined. You can count on me for whatever you need." Maria felt a wave of relief, but also tiredness. She didn't know how, but at that moment, she had taken a definitive step towards conquering her own place in the world. It wasn't her father's approval or the investor's immediate recognition that made the difference. What really changed her that day was the realization that she didn't need anyone's permission to be who she was. She was already everything she needed to be. As Maria left the room, she felt the weight of her internal battle finally being lifted. She had overcome not only external prejudices and limitations, but more importantly, she had overcome her own fears. She now knew that if she wanted to conquer the world, she had to believe in herself first. As Maria left the meeting, she felt that the weight she had been carrying for so long was finally beginning to dissipate. The fear of being judged, of not being good enough, of being seen only as the millionaire's daughter, no longer paralyzed her. She now understood that true approval would not come from others, but from her own ability to face herself and overcome her own limits. It wasn't immediate success or validation from an investor that would define her trajectory, but her courage to assert herself, to recognize herself as someone who didn't need to prove herself to anyone. What had happened at that meeting, more than any contract or promise of partnership, was a fresh start. Maria no longer needed to hide behind a name or someone else's expectations. She was a woman of value, with her own path and her own achievements. And most importantly, she learned that by being true to herself, she was able to go beyond any challenge. When she finally looked in the mirror at the end of the day, she saw a stronger version of herself. A woman who had won the toughest internal battle she could face. Now Maria knew that the future was in her hands, and no judgment, no humiliation could stop her from achieving everything she had ever dreamed of. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.